Welcome back to more Warhammer lore. In this episode, we'll be delving into the vampire bloodlines for the last time, at least for the time being. We will, of course, be covering the most famous, or, well, infamous of the Arisen in the von Carsteins. As always, I will be pulling this information from the latest army books and the Warhammer fantasy novels. Now, an important distinction between this video and the previous bloodlines is that I will not be going into great detail on the founding of the bloodline. This is because the founder, Vashanesh, or Vlad von Carstein as we know him, will be getting his own video later on in the near future. And also because at this point I am rather exhausted of retelling the same story over and over again, simply from different angles. So, this video will focus on the von Carstein bloodline as a society, where they can be found, their specific characteristics, and of course their strengths and weaknesses. So without further ado, let's get into the lore proper. Oh, and before we start, I have gotten quite a few comments about the founding of the vampires. Specifically the infamous magical elixir that there was just enough of to found the original members, or if all vampires stem from Neferata in the form of the Blood Kiss. Now, this is a lore anomaly in the Warhammer world. I credit this to the conflict that Games Workshop created when they released the army books with some information, and then had the Time of Legends series written with a different lore origin. And this is where your own preference comes into play. The vampires are probably one of the worst in this aspect as far as lore conflict, but there are many others, and we will no doubt get to them all one day. Now, as a whole, I prefer a good story. It is what I value most in any form of entertainment I engage in, whether that be a video game or a universe I can only read about. And the origin story for the vampires in the army book is rather bland, in my opinion. It is full of plot holes, but there's also part of it that I do actually enjoy that was not included in the novels. And so I like to mix and match the lore so that it makes the most sense and is the most interesting version that I see it as. Which means that I prefer the novel version of the origin story, in that Neferata was the first product of the Blood Kiss, and the subsequent bloodlines are products of her blood and the effects it seems to have on men versus women, or possibly even the potency of the Sphinx venom still coursing through her undead veins at that point. As always, this is my opinion, and I always have stated that is my opinion as far as the founding whenever I've done my other videos, and so that is the conflict. You might read something else if you look at just the army books, or if you look on a wiki page. I've noticed a lot of them are just copies of the army books, and so you might see something different there versus the novels. As a whole, I prefer the novels, but there are cases that they fall short, and so I do mix and match when needed to make the story whole. So now that we've got that out of the way, let's move on, because I doubt you came here to hear me ramble on about the nuances of lore conflicts, or maybe you did, but either way we should get back on track and start delving into the von Carsteins. As far as a society is concerned, the von Carsteins, or as they are more well known, the Vampire Counts, have the most open and structured society of any of the bloodlines. This has much to do with Vlad von Carstein and the legacy he left after taking over the imperial province of Sylvania, or Sylvania, depending on how you want to say it, and becoming the very first Vampire Count. Like I said, we will go into more greater detail later on in the Vlad video, but to summarize Vashanesh, or as he was going by then, Vlad von Carstein, he showed up in Sylvania during the time the current Elector Count Otto von Drac was on his deathbed, and had made an invitation of any nobleman that they could have his province if they would marry Isabella, his daughter, in order to prevent his brother from inheriting his title. Otto, having run out of time, happily gave away his daughter to this foreigner and promptly died. Thereafter, Vlad began his rule of Sylvania, and for the most part, it was more pleasant than what the peasantry had suffered under from the von Drac family. which is saying much because they were being ruled over an undead monstrosity that viewed them as little better than animals. And this is where the bones of what the Vampire Count society would be laying. There is a rigid aristocracy between the Vampire Counts and the peasantry that they rule over, or more accurately, the cattle they watch over, as they do in fact think of all mortals as just that, cattle. You wouldn't invite your cow to sleep in your bed or hold lands, and so why should they treat their peasants any different than beasts? Of course they protect them, as well as any other province, and perhaps even better. But at the same time, they don't fret about feeding them or any kind of quality of life improvements they might enjoy, as long as they are present for the blood tax. And the blood tax varies from count to count. For some it is simply the firstborn daughter of any family must be given to the count to feed, or perhaps a particular count will only drink from virgins, or occasionally they don't really care and therefore have a raffle on who is eaten every month. Regardless of the implementation, the blood tax is a standard in the society of the Vampire Counts, and something you can find throughout all of Sylvania, which, as you can guess, puts a dour mood on the citizens of Sylvania, as they are fed upon openly, without being disguised as often as you would see in any other province that vampires might be in. Speaking of society and the undead aristocracy, if you have read anything about the Vampire Counts either in the army books or the novels, you will notice that despite all of these undead being founded by Vlad, they often do not share his name. In fact, the majority of them have different names entirely. This distinction is one of societal prestige than them actually being of different blood. They are all technically of the von Carstein bloodline, unless proven otherwise, which does happen from time to time, specifically with Lamian spies infiltrating their houses or lands. But for instance, in the Vampire Wars novels, one of the pivotal characters is John Skelling, a former vampire hunter, or witch hunter to be exact, turned vampire of the von Carstein bloodline, but he does not have the name. On the other hand, there is another vampire sired by the name of Jarek, who takes on the name of von Carstein as a show of his prestige. The only difference between these two is who they are sired by. Derek is given the blood kiss by Vlad himself, and Skelling is given it by a vampire 2 to 3 generations down from Vlad. In a way, the name seems only to be passed down to direct descendants of Vlad, from those that he chose to give the name, or those of his gets that chose to give the name to any they see as worthy in each sequential generation. And so the name is simply a title. That doesn't necessarily amount to any prestige unless you are from the original sires of Vlad von Carstein, which there are not many left. Matter of fact, I believe there is one left. Technically, maybe 2 if you count something that happened in the Vampire Wars. Now, you may be asking yourself, that is awfully complicated, and how do they decide who is worthy and who isn't? And my answer is that there is no direct pattern to any of it. It seems to be done at any von Carstein's whim. In their society, only the strong and cunning are valued, and so any bearing the name of von Carstein, or sired by one, is expected to be gifted in strategy, deception, and above all, the good grace not to mingle with those of lesser lineage than themselves, meaning humans and any other bloodline, as they are all inferior to the von Carsteins, and so you would think that would narrow down the pool of people that could possibly be turned, and to an extent it does. But that does not stop counts from turning a favorite housekeeper or servant, or even starting an undead harem from the peasantry simply because they had good looks. Now, technically, according to their rigid societal rules, these beings should not exist, as they do not further the bloodline, and so often the strong or the cunning will often war and cull rival houses on the basis, whether it be true or not, of a lack of strength in the bloodline, meaning that Sylvania, while relatively more safe than an average imperial province, is a hotbed of vampire conflict, often dragging the cattle into the open mouths of the undead aristocracy and their petty games of political subterfuge and rank. Now, it is also important to note that the vampire counts do not hide their existence from the world. They are completely open with their subjects as to what they are and why they are better and deserve to rule. In any other province, this would not last long, as the witch hunters and the zealots of any religion would have rooted out and burned these undead abominations at the stake. But in Sylvania, a purposely groomed backwater swamp, where communication with the rest of the empire is limited, they have essentially free reign, as despite their existence, their rule goes relatively unnoticed, and what little information makes it to the other elector counts is dismissed as either hearsay or nothing worth sallying an army to cleanse, as moving any kind of troops through the swampy marshes of Sylvania will lead to severe attrition, either through disease or the very denizens of said marshy terrain, including the vast amount of undead that are laid to rest in this area. And so the societal structure of the undead aristocracy has gone relatively unchecked since the time of Vlad, and very few nuances of their culture has changed since the Vampire Wars. For instance, the ruling houses are still relatively the same. You have the von Carsteins, and you have other houses of lesser prestige, not saying that they're any less skilled. And each house is ruled over by the eldest, or the most powerful of the bloodline in that aspect, and they are constantly at war with each other. You can think of it as kind of like Game of Thrones in the houses from them. It's very eerily similar to that aspect as far as a ruling society goes. And of course, the only problem with moving up in a society where everyone essentially is immortal is that there is no way to move up without the demise of your betters. So treachery is the lay of the land, as you can obviously understand, as there is no hope for anybody that is not at the top of the food chain to ever move up said food chain without the removal of those at the top. Oh yes, not only do the Skaven deal in this way, but the vampires are very infamous for their betrayals of one another. Now, it is also important to note that not all vampire counts are actually terrible rulers. In fact, there are some that are actually loved by their people, who willingly give themselves over for the blood tax. This also brings up one of the distinctions of the von Carsteins to other bloodlines. The von Carsteins, despite their superiority complex, are rather open-minded when it comes to allowing women into positions of power. In fact, it would not be uncommon to see female vampires on the field of battle or ruling over a province. In this way, they are one of two bloodlines that I can confirm allow women to be turned at all and also give them positions of prestige. The first and obviously being the Lamian bloodline, and then, of course, the von Carsteins. The Lamians, of course, are exclusively women, and then the von Carsteins seem to be whatever works best is their motto. Now, this does not mean that there are not female Strigoi or Necrarchs or even Blood Dragons. It simply means that they are not specifically referenced often, or I have not yet come across them in my many novels I have read about the Warhammer Fantasy Universe, and I do not see any direct references to them in the army books. I might be overlooking this. Feel free to leave a comment in the comment section if you have found anything like that, because I would really like to know about it, and maybe I'll include it in a future video. And then this leads us into the characteristics of the von Carstein bloodline. All von Carsteins are completely and utterly vain or prideful, and usually a bit of both. They value appearances above all else and go to great lengths to show off their power and prestige in any way possible. In the same way, they are extremely proud of their heritage, so much that if they believe that you are disrespecting them or their name in any way, they will certainly kill you, and possibly anyone associated with you, including loved ones and perhaps somebody you bumped into on the street. In fact, if a von Carstein ever says that they will hunt you down to the ends of the earth for as long as they live, they very well mean to keep that promise, as they pride themselves on their word and their twisted sense of honor associated with their rule. Of course, they also are a rather treacherous lot, and so every turn of phrase must be carefully examined before being agreed to, as often the devil is in the details. For instance, one up-and-coming vampire count may secure aid in toppling a rival, only to find out after they have lost their head that a day was never agreed upon, and their ambusher may have been tipped off to their whereabouts. In this way, all von Carsteins are forced to either become experts in the game of politics and high society, or learn, either brutally or through treacherous means, the value of subterfuge and political guile. Now, when we talk about them being vain and obsessed with appearances, I do not simply mean whom they are associating with and how big their castle is, although that does play into it. I am also talking about literal appearances, how they physically look, and much to many von Carstein's dismay, they were not exactly blessed with the natural alluring good looks of the Lamians. But they are by no means ugly, well, usually. Since vampires cannot see their own reflection, they cannot view themselves without the aid of either magic or a more practical means. You see, if you ever find yourself the guest of a von Carstein, especially one of any note, you will find many and rather large painted portraits of themselves throughout their holdings, as this is the only way they will ever be able to see themselves. And it is the only way they will be able to see what others see when they look at them, which is kind of the point of this. They are very self-obsessed, and they want to know what others think of them in this way. So really, their self-obsession revolves around almost an insecurity as to what they think they might look like to others, when in fact, it really doesn't matter. I mean, they're an undead aristocracy that does whatever they want, so why does it matter to begin with? But it is one of those characteristic traits of the von Carstein bloodline that really solidifies them as the traditional count, the traditional elite of the vampires that they believe themselves to be. And now would be a good time to transition over to the weaknesses of the bloodline. There are, of course, the standard weaknesses as not having a reflection and being able to tolerate sunlight, but sunlight can be conquered like many of the other bloodlines. In fact, Manfred von Carstein has actually been seen walking around outside for years, able to withstand the kiss of the sun. They, of course, are weakened by its effects, but they are also able to withstand it. The same can be said of any consecrated ground, any religious symbols. Much in the same way of other bloodlines, they still will be able to tolerate it, but it does weaken them to an extent. They, of course, are also weakened by silver, and especially wounds inflicted by this can sometimes never be healed. Likewise, fire is an ever-present danger, as though their healing abilities far outstrip mere mortals. You can't heal what has been burned to a crisp. And of course, if they ever get their heads cut off, that is the final death. Well, that is unless you have access to the von Carstein ring, or are important to the end-time storyline. I'm looking at you, Manfred. In addition to the normal weaknesses, von Carsteins are also very prone to what I might describe as mania, as many of their bloodline do in fact lose their sanity and are prone to self-destructive habits. The most famous case is Conrad von Carstein, who seemed to have a almost form of schizophrenia. He was hearing voices. This also might be more present in the von Carstein bloodline, simply because it is more than likely the most diluted. One of the dangers of wantonly giving out the blood kiss is that every sequential generation of vampire is weaker than the last, both physically and mentally. For this reason, many of the von Carstein bloodline today are not nearly as deadly as they were several hundred years ago. Of course, there are still some of the old guard around, and that is not to say that the vampires are weak by any means, just that they are one of the most numerous of the bloodlines entirely, and therefore one of the weakers in some cases. This is very minute cases, but it does need to be stated that since there are so many of them and there are so many generations down, their lesser gets are going to be very much weaker than the most recent additions to some of the other bloodlines. Though they still would be leaps and bounds above what any mere human would be capable of. So I'm not saying that they are not deadly superior individuals, just in the vampire hierarchy, they're probably pretty low on the strength scale, and the wit scale at that, the new additions, that is. And now we can move on to the strengths of the bloodline. The von Carsteins are a rather unique lot in that they are kind of a jack-of-all-trades bloodline. They can be expert casters, on par with a Necrarch, or martial masters, able to even match one of the infamous blood dragons. They can be feral beasts, similar to the Strigoi, or cunningly seductive, like the Lamians. But where they are unique is in their charisma. And I know that is kind of an unusual strength, but they are very good at getting what they want and inspiring both their kind and the cattle to action for their own devices. This is how many counts can rely upon human troops in their armies. It's not out of fear of death. Well, it probably is, but it also is out of sheer ability that they seem to have to inspire those around them to action, which makes them excellent leaders in both armies and ruling lands, which they do both with pride and a smug look on their face, just so that you know that they are better than you. And they do in fact make great generals, as for the most part they have a knack for battlefield tactics, possibly on par with the blood dragons. But unlike them, they know the value of protecting their own life and allowing their lessers to wage war for them. They often utilize vast hordes of undead and employ necromancers to do the fighting for them. As far as necromancers are concerned, the von Carstein bloodline does have a gift of magic, capable of mastering the winds of death and the lore of vampires, or necromancy, as we might know it. That does not mean that all vampires of this lineage can use magic, as can once again be seen by the envious Conrad von Carstein during the Vampire Wars, who did not register even a whiff of magical aptitude and had to rely on others to raise his zombie hordes. Now, as far as natural strength and combat prowess without refinement, I would place the von Carsteins in the center. Not the strongest, fastest, or even magically inclined, but certainly the most ambitious and driven, which makes them capable of mastering these facets of the other bloodlines easy, as they are dedicated through either magical or training to attain any goal they set for themselves. Oh, and I nearly forgot to mention that the von Carsteins are also unique in their skin change. They seem to embrace their inner beast in the form of a great direwolf. Not a werewolf, not a skin wolf, to be exact, but an actual massive wolf capable of all that you can imagine. And they often do in fact hunt for prey in these forms in packs, leading to tales of large beasts dragging down unsuspecting peasants in the province of Sylvania. And that about wraps it up for the von Carstein Bloodline lore video. In summary, the von Carsteins are the middle ground for the vampires, capable of mastering whatever they please, and the most ambitious of their kind, with a knack for politics due to their inert charisma and showmanship. They are the classic vampire we see in other media with a Warhammer twist. As always, guys, I would like to thank you for sitting through this video if you have made it to the end, and I hope that you learned something new about the vampire counts. There is more lore coming, and the army video should be up relatively soon, if I have no complications. If you have not already, I do ask that you both like this video and subscribe to the channel and join the ever-growing Cult of Thick. Yes, you heard me. Cult of Thick. It really does help the channel, guys, and it helps it grow and places these videos higher in the YouTube algorithm. Now, I do make mistakes occasionally, and if you have any questions, feel free to leave them in the comment section, and I will do my best to either answer them or include some kind of response in any of my upcoming lore videos. As always, guys, thank you for watching, and I hope to see you all very soon. Have a good day.